Are we ready? Hi, apparently we are on the interwebs. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Welcome. I'm glad we're not too tight in here. I was worried. My name's Christopher Hastings, and I work at Southwest Tennessee Community College. I'm the coordinator of their ESL programs there, and I'm here for us to talk about intercultural communication in the ESL classroom. And this is something I spent a lot of time working on previously the 4 years when I was as an English language fellow with the Department of State, which we are giving a presentation on at 4 o'clock. We have another one at 3 o'clock, but 4 o'clock, if you're interested in the English language fellow program, I invite you. We're 2 rooms down in the Saddlebread room. I would love to talk to anybody who's interested in it. Anyways, a little bit about me. I've been an EFL teacher for 17 years now. It's starting to date me, starting to make me feel dated. I was educated in English and with applied linguistics, and Spanish was my big interest. So I did not start off with sociology or with intercultural communication, but 17 years of, thank y'all. 17 years of living overseas and teaching in the U.S. at 7 countries outside the U.S. And my wife is from Lebanon, so every single day is like an information gap activity. So after this much of the time, it's sort of been like intercultural communication has become our life. And in the past, couple years working in Russia, it was that as well. So I'm here for us to talk about different dimensions of intercultural communication. And I'm going to talk to you basically about how I teach culture and how I work on culture with my students, especially now currently at Southwest Community College. I've been in a very fortunate position. I'm teaching freshman composition, but an ESL section of it. And through a mix-up at our university's office, they opened it up to native speakers. So I have classes that are half native speakers and half ESL in both of my composition classes. And I was very nervous, I was very scared, and I decided to take all my readings and make them intercultural communication. And I've been having the Americans help out the international students. The international students have given context to intercultural communication to my Americans. So it's actually turned out to be much better. So all of this is sort of stuff that I've been using in my classes, but this was how I taught intercultural communication while I was in Russia and China. And so we'll briefly define culture and give some boundaries for intercultural communication. And then we're going to refer to a gentleman named Gert Hofstede and talk about cultural dimensions and how he uses them. And then I'm going to, time permitting, talk about critical incidences and how we use these to sort of examine intercultural communication. I've put my PowerPoint on the web. It's on the TNTESOL site, so you can download everything there. Someone do me a favor. I'm going to try to keep my eye on time. I would like to end at 2:50 because I have another thing to run to, and also I figured I'd give us time in between sessions. So somewhere around 2:45, someone just tell me, Chris, shut up. Like culturally, it's acceptable. You can do it. Just let me know to wrap up. That way I won't try to cover. This is part of a larger 3-hour workshop I had, and I've pared it down, and so I'm not going to go through all 567 slides with you during this time. Warning, there are generalizations, there are stereotypes ahead, and this is inherent in intercultural communication. And this is very important that we warn our students ahead of time that this is coming. It's really important that we let them know that we're going to talk about generalizations about behaviors. We're not making value judgments on people. Behaviors are arbitrary. Cultural generalizations are statements of likelihood. These are not statements of fact. I mean, people want to come into intercultural communications and say, all Arabs do this, all Chinese people do this, all X does this. And we want to break people out of that. We're talking about likelihood, we're not talking about certainty, and even within a culture. I mean, honestly, we're a room full of Americans, and we all have different worldviews here, and I'm sure that we could all identify other Americans with whom we don't share a worldview, right? So we have to highlight this to our students. It's especially important, because a lot of intercultural communication, especially if you want to go back 50 years or so, the way it would look at people, they very much looked at it as saying, okay, you're going to X country, then you need to do A, B, and C. And that doesn't always apply. To begin the journey and get our students talking about culture, it's really important to get them to sort of define what they know is the nature of culture, and what we want to make sure we're starting off with the same definition. And so I always pose early in the semester. I ask my students, what is culture? And I'll pose it to you all. What do we think of? The words we think of when we think of culture.
Music, art.
There we go. Music, art, language,
history, religion,
holidays,
shared
speech. All right, so we're getting all on this sort of stuff, like food, dress, music, visual arts, drama, literature, language. Actually, I think we didn't have religion, but everything else you all mentioned within the first 5.5 seconds. But I give my students time to mention this. I give them time to bring up examples of this. I lead them in just discussions about this. And I'm leading them down sort of a trap anyways, because this is obviously not the only thing we're looking for. So this is one definition of culture. And so I might ask them, and I like to start off with, especially as I was teaching this overseas, I would have them make generalizations about Americans. Because I didn't want to be like, I guess, a David Attenborough, like National Geographic special saying, here we see the Russian in his native habitat. And I don't want to ever be the foreigner doing that. So I would say, hey, y'all, make guesses about my culture. And so, what stereotypes and what images do you have of American culture? And put that. What do you think they answered with? McDonald's. And the weight issues that may come with McDonald's. What else? Come on in, y'all. The more the merrier.
Rich. Football.
Rich, money, sports, football. What else? Elvis. There we go. What else?
So I grew up in the Philippines, and I think the whole country has kind of like a higher, like we view Americans as like a superior, like race.
Yeah. All right, so we can get that. Now, I'll tell you what, living in Russia, we had some different views. Living in China, we had some different views. When I lived in Saudi and asking my students there, they had some different views on it. I want this to come from the students, and this is going to be leading them into their own impressions of themselves. I really never feel comfortable, especially being a white male coming in the room, I don't want to come in and say, all people are like, all Filipinos do this. Like, I don't ever want to be that person. I want to have it come from the students, and I want them to generate it. So what I got from a lot, McDonald's was right off the gate. Fast food seems to be the big one that I get from a lot of students. And that's everywhere. The weight issue that may come with. I'm from Memphis. We tend to be we eat a lot of barbecue. Patriotism, we may get a lot of. You'll get students mentioning our military presence. We got a lot of that when I was in Saudi. Sports, we already mentioned. Our gun culture comes up quite a lot. Money, rich, Hollywood, all versions of this come up, and students, you can discuss how these are different aspects of America that they can see. Now, and then I will ask the students, I'll flip it right back on them, and I will ask them, what are the stereotypes? These are some of the groups of students that I have at Southwest, which are some of our larger demographics of students. I'll ask them to give it, and I will ask the students to give it from their own culture. I almost never want to put, like in my class right now that's half ESL and half Americans, I don't ever want to put the American students in the position to say, so what are Vietnamese people like? Like, no, it's not comfortable. So I'm going to have the Vietnamese students tell me about that. We just did a reading on Tiger Mother from Amy Chua's Tiger Mother, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mom. And so I had different groups of students telling me about their own experiences, but it wasn't me. This all is leading us into what we call the iceberg concept of culture, and it's one of the many ways that we conceptualize it. We can talk about culture as an onion. We can talk about culture in different ways, but the iceberg is a pretty easy way to do it, and it's a very familiar way for one. And if we know anything about icebergs, which I don't know much about icebergs, except they're cold and they're big, and that 80% of them are below the water. And so we can make our students just recognize the fact that culturally, everything we've talked about thus far, everything they've seen in American culture, all the images, dress, clothes, all of that is visual, and that is something that we can observe, but it's also, it doesn't have a great cognitive weight on it. It's not what, it's easily recognizable, easily changeable. It's very easy for me to go to Saudi Arabia, throw on a thobe, to eat some kabsa, and to practice using some Arabic, and I can say that I've adjusted to life, but honestly, I haven't got the mindset of a Saudi, so I'm not below this emotional cognitive level. So I want to give y'all a couple minutes amongst yourselves, and I have listed here, I don't know, about 20 different, and I'll have my students do this, and I'll have them, once that we've made the distinction between surface culture or deep culture, I'll give them a list of stuff among themselves, and they have to categorize it for themselves. So, as in all TESOL conferences, turn next to whoever's next to you, and take 1 minute and 47 seconds to try to decide, are these surface culture or deep culture? Which ones are which? Starting now. Go. Don't you wish you could do that in our actual class? Oh my God. I didn't even have to do the clap thing. Oh my God. I'll make you... Room full of my people. Like. Alright, so what sort of stuff did we say was visible? And this is the easy part of it. But what sort of stuff did we say was visible? Can we remember from the list? Religious. Wait, there were two religious. There were rituals. So it's easy to go, religious rituals. It's easy for me to go to an Orthodox church and practice the bowing and the large this. But the religious beliefs, obviously. Whoa. I'm going to use that. All right, what else? What do we have?
Gesture may not be appropriate.
I know, right? Another intercultural communication. I'm going to have to watch it. Styles of dress, obviously. Religious rituals. Some gestures, but they're visible. We can see it. So we know that we don't use X gesture when we don't use this in some places, but we use it in some places. So in the Middle East, this means hold on a minute. As you're driving down the street, if there's a car coming in Saudi Arabia and he's doing this to you, He's not telling you to do something to yourself. He's telling you, I have the right of way and you better hold on a minute. Yeah, it was very odd. I thought he was doing something to me the first time and I was not happy with it. And then invisible. Those beliefs. How we think about time. What values we come to. What do we think? Yes?
I just have a question about like the invisible stuff. So we were talking about notions of modesty and concept of personal space. So I can see how those are very abstract and would be below the surface, but the manifestations of them are very noticeable.
Absolutely.
That people know if someone is too close to them.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and you naturally start doing
Right,
this.
exactly, and you could chase you around the room.
Or you can teach someone that very easily. That's what you're talking about. Like, you can tell someone that's going to a different culture, hey, their personal space is different, and they can like learn the behavior, but like it's still not.
Right.
Okay,
I mean,
so
how comfortable do you feel with someone touching you?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I know as a young man living in Brazil and I would get multiple kisses on the cheek. I thought this was the greatest thing in the world. Yet our handler, our closest family friend in China, we gave her a hug. And she was very close to us emotionally and personally. And we gave her a hug and she froze. And she felt very uncomfortable. So, I mean, I guess, I like it. So, physical manifestation, deep culture feeling. That makes sense. All right, so it is visible and invisible simultaneously. So one thing I might do after we've gone through this, and I might ask students to find out like areas of deep culture in their own cultures. Misunderstandings between your cultures and others. So I might ask them to I want them to come up with some rules. So what is normal, what is polite, what is it rude to do, and let's come up with a set of rules for people just so that, your guidelines, and this is still very easy level 101 sort of stuff, and it's easy for them to talk about. Right now, I went through this with my students in their 1010 class, and it was really fun because most of my American students had no idea on a lot of this. I mean, a lot of my students in Memphis at the community college have not been privileged enough to travel very extensively in the U.S., much less outside the U.S., so their impact with other cultures is limited at best. Let's see, what do we got? One of my favorite activities would be to use videos. So I've got Life of Brian here. And I might ask my students, I might show them, what does haggling mean? What does the description mean? And then just from watching, I don't know if anybody's familiar with this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? I guess I don't have a speaker in here, do I?
We can make the voices if you want.
She's a witch.
So, they're in the market. How much for this? 20 shekels? I don't want to read it to you. What? There you are. Wait a minute. What? You're supposed to haggle. Continue on here, but this is, so I might ask my students to start off here and then ask them to tell me what are the rules that come along with this and any sort of culture, and as we come to critical incidents later, we want to find out like what are the rules. I mean, everywhere we go, we're going to have a different set of rules. I might, and this was a very easy thing for me to do when I was in China and Russia. I could basically put up how do our countries compare with regards to, and I would put different access, so personal space, and have students start to define it for me. Touching. Where is it all right to touch and when is it not? There's definitely a different norm in Saudi Arabia than there is in the U.S. Men to men holding pinkies together. It was very interesting for me to have my male friends holding my hand and holding my pinky. Whereas going to shake a woman's hand in Saudi men, it's a sign of closeness. Two men it's very cute. You can do butterfly kisses. You can do butterfly kisses with your nose too. To a male friend, two males that are friends, walking like this, do this, butterfly kisses. It was pretty fun. It was interesting. It as a Southern male, it took me a little bit by surprise. It was not something I was immediately comfortable with. And then going to shake hands with a woman, there we go, cultural no-no. I learned eye contact. I was teaching in Korea. I had a student, Jaewon. Jaewon had been very bad. He was throwing things across the room, being crazy, and I was lecturing him, and he was looking down at the ground. And what did I say to him? I said to him the most American thing possible. Look at me when I'm talking to you, right? And my co-teacher's like, no, Chris, you're confusing him right now. He's trying to show you respect. He's looking at the ground. And me, bull in the china shop, messing up everything interculturally. That's been the nature of my experience teaching overseas, has been messing things up culturally. Dating practices, obviously very different in different areas we're going to go to. Concept of time, and I think I have a slide on concept of time a little bit later, but one of the things, first things I'll do is like, okay, come to my house at 5 o'clock tonight. And then I give them all Post-it notes, and I put a timeline up there, 5 o'clock, all the way back down to 4 o'clock and up to 6 o'clock, and I'm like, what time do you show up? And they come and visually put where they are in the line. Because concepts of beauty. What does beauty mean? Living in Asia, a lot of people cover up and are very watch out for the sun, so they don't want to be darker. They want to keep nice fair skin. Whereas being American, I just want to get a little color. I wish I had some. I've got this cheap white skin. It burns easy. You know, I want to get out there in bronze. But not only, and this is, I think, almost more importantly, especially in the concept, in the context that I'm in right now, is teaching students the way academic deep culture is different. Teaching in Russia, students are used to being attacked by teachers, not physically, but answering a question is an invitation for the teacher to attack you for being wrong. So there's no real positive gain to be had because you're asking a question, you know, oh God, here I go, I'm going to do it. In China, a lot of times it was a similar sort of thing, not being attacked, but there wasn't as much of, there was not as much to answer a question. For example, if I ask a question to the class and you got 50 students in my class or 60 or more, God forbid, and they're not going to be raising their hands as quickly. Whereas in the US, we're sort of taught to raise our hands very quickly, run up, you know. And if I say, what's the capital of France? And someone goes, Barcelona. Now, in the US, we say, that's all right, Johnny. Good try. You're on the right continent. They're right next to each other. Let's try again. Not in Russia. In Russia, idiots. Like, you sort of laugh at them. How dare you, you know? And in China, you might bring shame upon yourself for being that wrong. So, some things. Wait time. This has been a big issue. How long, as a teacher, is it appropriate for us to wait before when we ask a question until we, A, answer it ourselves, or B, volunteer someone to answer that question for us? Eye contact with our students, physical space, being around the concept of time again, when to raise their hand, when not to. Teacher versus student-centered classroom. I mean, this is one of the big things, you know, we've worked in TESOL for half a century on this, moving it to being a student-centered and focus on the language that they need. And it is not that way in a lot of parts of the world. So students come into that and are not necessarily used to the teacher operating like that. We also have to recognize that if they come into a situation and they're expecting a teacher to tell them a specific answer and the teacher to lead the classroom, and then I want to be Mr. Facilitator, not sage on the stage, I'm breaking an expectation of theirs, and I'm going to make it hard. So I have to prep them for that. I have to know what they're coming in. Helping each other, whether students are helping each other or whether that's considered cheating. I put this up here from Calvin and Hobbes, and as much as I hate people reading slides to you, I'll read it to you. When you're a kid, you don't have much variety of experience. You live with your parents. That's all you know. You grow up thinking whatever they do is normal. Now, a very American experience is spending the night over at other children's houses. And I remember the first time I stayed at Chris Chimey's house. He lived behind me, and he was my best friend. And I noticed that everything that they did in their house was different than the way we did in my house. And up until that moment, I thought my parents were normal. Then I realized they weren't. Now it's on the internet that I've been telling my parents are not normal. But now that we understand that we are not normal, that there is a new normal we move into, and that's the hope that hopefully we start off with students looking. You have a sense of normal, but you're not. You're abnormal. We can begin our intercultural communicative journey. You have to realize that my normal is different from your normal, different from your normal, and that needs a foundation with our students. That needs a foundation for teachers too. I mean, I work with a number of teachers who are not necessarily used to dealing with international students, and they have a normal, and a student comes in and breaks that normal, and they want to know why. So some guidelines. We really need to start off and know our own culture and our own communication style. That is of prime importance, because if we don't understand what we're bringing to the situation, it's very hard for us to understand what our students are bringing. Then we want to learn the communication rules for the other. We want to learn, what are they operating with? What is this other culture operating with? We need to approach this with the goal of of understanding culture, of understanding why interactions are happening the way they are, rather than trying to defend ours. We're never saying, well, my way is the right way, I know what's best, or whatever like this, I was taught this. We're trying to just understand interactions. Definitely want to avoid an ethnocentrism, but I'm speaking to a room full of ESL teachers, so obviously preaching to the proverbial choir here. And we want to practice mental yoga. We want to be flexible. Flexible to break assumptions, to be in positions of uncomfort. Now I'm going to use Gert Hofstede's cultural dimensions. And has anybody heard of Hofstede? Any chance? Hofstede was a social scientist paid by IBM in the 60s, and he had 30 years. I'm going to pass this back. If y'all would, you know how this works. Leave one for me. Gert Hofstede was hired by IBM to figure out how people worked well together from different cultures. He did I want to say it was like 150,000 surveys over the course of 30 years. And he basically did surveys of people working in different countries, how they work together, and he came up with a list of cultural dimensions. Basically, these were dimensions on how he saw cultures differ. He started off with a list of 4 or 5 and then added it to 6, and it's one way we can frame national cultures. We might have to get to sharing. I only ran off 30 of these. Let me know. They're still going around. I am going to give us, you'll see right here on your handy dandy handout, right here you will see that there's a list of questions. I have question category, and I'll put them up here. And we'll have the questions up here, and for each of them, I would like you to mark on this whether you agree with it. So if you agree with the statement on the left, it'll be a 1. If you agree with the statement on the right, it's a 5, and then anywhere in between, you choose. At the end of each category, you'll have a total score. And this is a much abbreviated version of the test that Gert Hofstede did. Like, his was something like 100 questions or so, but I figured time constraints, we don't really have that. So, in this first one, and use which one seems the most familiar, which one do you agree with? We are in question category 1, and you'll just go 1, 2, 3, 4 across here and come up with a total score. So the first one is about children's opinions, then about questioning authority, then about your role in an organization, and questioning your boss. I'll give you a minute. Nope. So what you're doing is you're working across.
Yeah, so like the first, last.
Yeah, first.
Line. Like here, so you see.
I mean, you could do a category this way if you wanted, but it is.
Each
just
category is going to have 4 questions. Each is 5.
Maybe it was not as intuitive as I thought it was.
It's not.
I think because they're going this way, and you want to do your scores
I
that
just
way.
realized. It's the first time I've ever made it, and without just telling people to write on their own paper.
Yeah.
So you're coming up with a score. So If you think that children's opinions are as important as their parents, I would do a 1. And then I think that children can question 1, and then I do this. I totally believe this, and I would do 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, and I would total up to 4. So the lowest score you could have is a 4, and the highest you could have is a 20, and a 12 means you're just like, I'm not deciding, I'm going down the road. We need another minute. Are we good? Anybody need more time? Once, twice, there we go, bing. Same but different. Bless you. Ideally, you're going to have 4 full scores. Boom. Next one, category 3. One, group 4. It's purposefully ambiguous. And in the original survey, these come in they come in a random order, so they're not all grouped. But here you can kind of see. Last one. I love that that's the new note taking now. I have students do it at the end of class. I'm like, get out your phones, take a picture. That's the homework. You have a visual record now. All right. Each sets of these questions relate to one of the cultural dimensions that he identified. Now, one of these I did not include is indulgence and restraint. But power distance, individualism, collectivism, long-term orientation, short-term orientation, masculinity, femininity, and then uncertainty avoidance. And first one, power distance. And this photo comes from a lovely little book called East Meets West. You can Google it. And it was a Chinese graphic designer who lived in China until like 12 years old and then was raised in Germany for the rest of the time. So she compares blue would be Germany for her and red would be China. And having students decide, what color are you? How purple are you? Or how reddish are you? And where it has been a lovely example. But so this is the image that she has for boss. As you know, so the boss looms above us, or there's, you know, the boss is one of us. And so this would be basically, this is summarizing what power distance would be. How comfortable do we feel telling our boss that our boss is wrong? How comfortable do we feel speaking up to power, and where are you allowed to do that? I can tell you when I lived in Korea, the power distance is pretty high. So I was at a work meeting, and my boss had said something to us, and everybody at the table knew that this was factually inaccurate. And me, again, bull in China shop, said, "Boss, Miss Kim, you're wrong." Like, "No, that's not right. We were talking about it. We know it's not right." And underneath the table, my Korean colleagues are kicking me in the shins. And I'm like, "But it's wrong." And they're like, "Shut up, Chris." And then later they say, "No, they know it's wrong. She's going to know it's wrong. We're going to back channel this to her, but you don't tell the boss that they're wrong in front of the entire staff. How dare you?" Now, I thought I was being polite. I did it a little more polite than that, but still somewhat oafishly when it is considered with Korean culture. So these questions were all about power distance and how well you are able to speak up to power or talk to power. As you might guess, the U.S. has a relatively low power distance, at least the image of it. We think that we can speak up to power. We think that our voices can be heard. So, I mean, hence we feel the need to get on Facebook and tell everybody what we think about everything, because we have the right to speak it up to power, right? It's not always true everywhere. So how does it compare, in some places? So we have a low power distance, but you might go to other countries where there's a much higher power distance. Now, this is going to play into classroom interaction. Yes?
I have a quick question,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of my friends, the students are from Yemen.
Mm-hmm.
Would they kind of fit in the Saudi Arabia category, or would they be totally different?
In my personal experience, similar, same but different. Similar but different. There is definitely that's a whole longer conversation. There's a different culture in Yemen.
So the guy go with 16 or whatever.
Similar.
Or Saudi Arabia?
Yeah. Now this comes into our classroom. Like, what happens to a student who comes from a high level of power distance where you don't speak up to power, and if the teacher is in a position of power, the teacher is an authority. So am I going to question my teacher? How am I going to address my teacher? When there's a high power distance, students will be more dependent upon their teacher. Small power distance, my American students come and say, "Hey, Chris," and I tell them all to call me Chris. My international students often have a hard time doing that because it just seems downright rude to them to do it to me. Treating with respect, treating more as equals, sometimes almost too equal. Large power distance is more conducive toward teacher-centered education and towards students expecting that. And small power distance is students expecting student-centered evaluation. Then it can also mean, teachers initiate all communication in the class versus students feel more of a right to do that and to say what they think. And this can play in interactive with my students. If I'm dealing with a group right now, I have half of international and half of local. Some students, more local students, are more used to speaking up and talking to me in a way that some of my international students might not be as comfortable. Large power distance, teacher gets higher spot of respect. We get to be on the mountain and transferring our personal wisdom, but here we're just experts in something and transferring truths about something. The next group that you had was individualism versus collectivism. And this is how do we think. It's the I think, or do we say we think? How do we think as a culture? You may be familiar with the concept of high context cultures and low context cultures. And high context cultures tend to be more we think. High context cultures being where one demographic of people has lived together for a long period of time. And they don't have to say a lot of rules out loud because they all know the same rules. Korea is one of those. Then Bull in China Shop comes in and doesn't know the rules, needs to be spoken the rules. I need to, and I don't do the we think. I do the I think. I'm a good American. So this was these set of questions, like how much freedom do we have? How are we concerned about this? USA, really high on the individuality. Mm-hmm. And that's, you can ask anywhere in the world you go, and they pretty much know it's the I culture. And how does this play out? There's the outlier. Everybody else has that a little bit more lower. Now, there's a much larger list. If you Google Gert Hofstede and cultural dimensions, you can get to his website. You can take the quizzes online, the materials online. You can choose better questions than I may have chosen for you. But this might be, how does it play in the classroom? Come up here. So individualize. We're trying to think, how do we learn? You can initiate things as a student on your own. You can initiate conversations. You're expected to speak up. You can associate with people according to your interests versus in-group. Associating versus in-groups, or speaking up only when it's sanctioned by the group. So there was, in China, definitely had much more of a collectivist culture. And so speaking up outright and being the student who pops up the hand all the time was not really accepted by the group. I look at it too in here from her book as well. So personal image of me, in my opinion, versus me. And you see personal branding too. So here, and from the collectivist culture, you have a big idea, but you say, it's a small idea. And individualistic culture, we have a little idea. I have the greatest idea ever. I feel like in America we tend to speak in superlatives. Now, masculinity, femininity, and this is only partially related to gender and sex, but it is also related to it. I mean, I think of it more as masculine and feminine, like sort of gender and language almost. But these were the questions, basically, the ideas were, the questions that said, I'll put these in bad order, I'm going to come back to it. These were the questions here that asked us how we thought between winners and losers and taking care of each other and whatnot. The way I look at this, for example, I have sympathy for those who do not win, and I envy others for their success, and then I admire as winners and think those who lose must be punished. I look at this as being sort of, think about our healthcare system and compare it to the healthcare system of Sweden or Norway. So Sweden or Norway would be much over here. So it's, let's take care of everybody. And over here, we have the American system where it's much more rooted in capitalism. So you have succeeded, you have won, you deserve the spoils, and sorry, if you didn't earn it, you don't deserve it. So one is masculine. It tends to be, they say he identifies this as cultures that say achievement and success. We have a hero, assertiveness, whatever. Ego-oriented, money is important, versus, think of children getting together. Competition versus interacting and taking care and nurturing and taking care of each other, and how do we get along. So femininity would be cooperation, caring about each other, working together, playing well with others. Let's take care of everybody. So that going back to the Swedish, Swedish healthcare, you will be taken care of because we're all taking care of each other. So that's sort of the way. U.S. actually tends to be right in the middle. I would have thought it would have been a little bit more on the masculine side. The reason there are decimal points here is because I took a much larger number and then divided it, because that was the actual score from them. So, a lot more similar than we have, but this is how our students sort of compare. So on my own time. Oh, we got 4 more minutes. All right. How does it? There we go. Brilliant teachers in mind versus friendly teachers in mind. competition in class, but over-ambition can be unpopular. Students may overrate their own performance in the masculine, and that's also with the individualistic. So once we start tying these together, we see characteristics that sort of overlap. Boom. Uncertainty avoidance. I famously tell all my students, anybody who's ever had my classes, I tell them that the correct answer is almost always it depends. But this is a very ambiguous answer. This is what we do in language, and it's not a popular answer for a lot of students. When they come from a culture that is not comfortable with ambiguity. So, are we comfortable with things changing? Or do we have long-standing traditions? Do we want a set answer? And it's hard for students when they come in and you have a vague teacher saying, well, it depends. When do we use this? It depends. So these were the questions these are the questions you do. And how much do we try to avoid uncertainty? How much are we trying to stick with the absolute positive? How much are we trying to avoid the ambiguous? In the US, I thought we would have been a little bit lower, but we got a sort of a low. We tend to be a little bit comfortable with some sort of ambiguity. And that being, we're cool with changing times. We're cool with things changing on us. In fact, change is sort of seen as natural. And I would have thought China would have been different, but it's also important to know that he started these questions 30 years ago, so even like the Russia answers, some of them are a little bit different. And I'm sure they've changed some over the years. Alright. So, when you want to avoid the ambiguity, you want to know a right answer. You want to know 2 + 2 = 4. And so an answer of, well, it depends, what are our other variables? Like that's not always, if someone is coming from a culture where they're trying to avoid uncertainty, my it depends answer is not acceptable. Teachers in this culture are supposed to have all the answers, and there's pressure for students to conform. Whereas when we're comfortable with the ambiguity, we want good discussions. A teacher can say, I don't know. And that's one of my favorite things to say in class as well. I don't know, but I'll find out. But in a lot of cultures, it's not acceptable for a teacher to admit, I don't know. And it's hard for students to accept that when they come in and they come from a culture where the teacher does know. And no teacher would be caught dead saying they don't know. And then you say, well, I don't know, we'll find out. Let's use this as a learning opportunity. And they're like, who is this hippie, right? Teachers inform parents or teachers involve parents. All right, moving on time. One more. I hate to be the person who flips through 567 slides in 1 minute. So, do we look at things versus the short term? Are we focused in the immediate past and present? Or are we looking for future, long-term goals? And that was this question. So, USA, we're in the moment. We're, YOLO. Let's do it now. Let's live right now. Give me my money. I want it now. Whereas a lot of other cultures have a long-term view on stuff. And you might question, how does this pop up? How does this compare? How does this pop up in the classroom? I think about this. You might say you attribute your success or failure to luck or to just saying you're good at something. America is the only country I've ever heard someone saying, oh, you speak a second language. You must be good at languages. I'm not good at languages. No self-respecting Chinese student would ever say, I'm just not good at a language. No, they know to work, time, and effort. Like, invest. No Russian student would ever have said, well, I'm just not good at languages. I can't do that. No, they just study it until you know it. That's their rule. So, right, studying hard is the norm, learning to save versus enjoyment the norm. You're trying to have a good time. That's our short term. All right. So we might ask our students, how do these change the way we communicate? How does this, this is all under the surface. Now, I realize that I have only brought us through one, but rather than rushing through another 467 slides, I'm going to open up for questions, because we only have about 10 minutes left. I put the slide up here. I've got a couple things on there more for you to see. At the very end, and hold on 1 second here. See, like I said, 567 slides. There are 2 wonderful resources, and this course is starting right now. Now it says Understanding Russians. You may not be interested in learning about Russians, but this is really an intercultural communication class, taught by a Russian, but covering a lot of lovely material. And it's starting this week on Coursera. I took the class. I thought it was lovely. I took it because I had just moved to Russia and I wanted to learn about Russians, and instead I ended up studying intercultural communication with examples from Russians. But I found it extremely useful. You will notice that this is listed at the bottom of your sheet, right here. The other one, I think it's open all the time, and it's intercultural communication, and it's from Shanghai, I believe. I think they're at Shanghai. And that has, this is directly just related to intercultural communication, but as you might guess, it has a few more Asian examples than we might have. Another good resource would be the other one here, and I'll talk about it in the next presentations we've got. AmericanEnglish.state.gov is a website that's sponsored by the U.S. State Department, and one of the things we have is a English teaching forum. It's a peer-reviewed journal, and it's free. PDFs are online. They have lots of good activities, and they have it so you can search by sort of what level and what sort of activities you're looking at. But one lovely article written by a guy, Gerald Frank, and a lot of good ideas for raising cultural awareness in the classroom. And that's at the bottom of your sheet. Also at the top of your sheet, you'll see my email, and I want to say thank you all. Questions? As we heard from Ken Folsa this morning, any questions? The correct answer is no, right? I just like to say, give me 2 questions, and that usually solves it. Anyways, you all have a lovely afternoon. Let me know if you got any questions.